Yes, thank you so much, Chloe, for inviting me, as well as so many other people who I've come to know in recent times through a number of projects and communication that I look forward to being in conversation with, including Dana, Harris, and others. So there was a exciting journey to get to here today. I'll mention three parts of it. The first was I was excited to hear about the translation of Dark Deleuze into Greek because of its earlier intersection when it was translated in other languages that seems quite appropriate and I think continues to grow in the Greek context, namely at the intersection of politics and philosophy. For example, both the German and the French editions were published by presses who have a political focus and that do political philosophy, but often from a non-academic or a para-academic context. The second is that I have to admit, I know very little about the Greek context, and I'm very much hoping to learn more. And of the people I've come to know, like many, you all are incredibly brilliant, extensively well-read, and I am particularly interested in its connections to radical political traditions, not only historically, but recently through anarchism. Especially after the 2008 riots, I came to know Greece quite well because the actions in response to the killing of Alexei were quite publicized and documented in North America, including a book on my shelf that brings me great pleasure every time I read it, published by the press AK Press, called We Are an Image from the Future. And third, for the last few moments, I've been collaborating with many others on Quiver, a reading group and intellectual project that takes a page from this famous dialogue between Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze. And its motivating idea is to fashion new weapons for thought rather than simple tools or even description commentary. So before presenting some original thoughts, let me first reanimate the corpus of Dark Deleuze to provide some shared reference points for our subsequent discussion. Though, no doubt, I really appreciate being in conversation with so many interlocutors who've already brought the book and its ideas to the Greek audience. And so I imagine some of you may already be quite familiar with some of the ideas. The body of the book is a series of monstrous evolutions of Deleuze's thought. I think the best way to understand the evolutionary lines that I'm drawing here, we can consult two images of thoughts preferred by Deleuze himself. The first being furnished by the author Borges, whose essay, The Garden of Forking Paths, serves as an image of the structure of the virtual that I take as a point of influence. And then second, more abstractly, the development of species themselves, a material, molecular, almost invisible, indiscernible process in which the division of a single organismic species into two separate species is not a matter of fate, decision, will, or rationality. So then following this monstrous evolutionary, almost mutational method, I identified concepts from both Deleuze and his collaboration with Guattari that I felt had stopped driving thought, and I thus resurrected contrasting approaches from within Deleuze's own corpus to animate a new approach. And this is illustrated perhaps most precisely in a table I present at the end of the introduction, in which I give 2 rows of concepts. The first, I say, constitute a canon of joy, which I believe is a prevailing interpretation, especially among the English-speaking audience. We can have a separate conversation on why Deleuze seemed so popular in English, but the joyous approach, whose concepts include things like creating conceptions, constructing assemblages, asking questions of genesis, understanding a paradigm of realism, approaching difference through inclusive distinction, complexity, the rhizome, democracy, intensity, acceleration, science, nomos, molecular bodies, experience. And I contrasted them, and if we remember the method I laid out, not as a polar opposite or even a Kantian antinomy, but a forking path or an evolutionary split that I find to be dark. Not creating a neat parallelism or a dialectic, but something undiscovered. I pose them in direct contrast, but I'll list a few of these concepts that I think give the skeletal body and the form of movement of this reanimated, monstrous, almost dead or undead Deleuze. To destroy worlds, to unbecome, to transform. A materialism, not a crude materialism, but a materialism of transformation. Exclusive distinction, asymmetry, unfolding, conspiracy and communism, cruelty, escape, interruption, the barbarian, the outside, cataclysm, false and the powers of the false, and indiscernibility. So the goal of the book was not to present an argument, as arguments are meant to be disputed and then agreed with, dispensed, or perhaps incorporated, but a sort of alternative map through which D&G could be taken up once again, new, or as if for the first time for others to follow, to extend or add to, where these concepts or the alternative to the canon of joy would be things that others could appropriate to create their own projects, to use as motors or devices. While Chloe is right that Dark Deleuze has been a success in terms of translation and reception and many audiences and debates and provocations, in terms of shaking Deleuzians out of their dogmatic slumber, all of these helpful so far. The one thing that I would say remains to be thought, or remains to begin even, is still the project of breathing life into these sort of monstrous terms that I create and taking another step with them. So in terms of an original set of remarks today, I'd like to discuss 3 abstract problems or issues, but give them some weight. First, the problem. Second, a question of means. And third, the issue of style, and hope that they draw together within a sort of consistency. So let us first begin with the problem, or perhaps more specifically, Deleuze's disgust for propositions, axioms, and thought experiments. His revulsion to propositional thinking is a bit peculiar for a French philosopher, as French philosophical culture brags of René Descartes and his geometric method for rational presentation. Parenthetically, perhaps that's why Spinoza is so interesting to Deleuze, as someone who comes from a seemingly rational tradition, but by the time Deleuze is done with him, he is thoroughly materialist in outlook and function. But Deleuze found rationalism, propositions, and thought experiments utterly bloodless, good only for court philosophers who seek to serve the state. Here, the state is meant in both senses. First, the governmental state, whose institutions survey land to make it into territory to be annexed or controlled, to collect statistics on people and things to make them into a population and resources, but also in a second sense of the state as the static, the stable, or the fixed state of affairs. So Deleuze, by contrast, professed to only liking one thought experiment, the so-called problem of future contingents, whereby statements like, there will be a sea battle tomorrow. And what he seemed to like about these were that the statement could be true when spoken, but given the unruly contingency of the future, the battle could perhaps not even happen, and thus undermine the ground of truth itself. Additionally, in contrast to thought experiments, he instead looked to problems, conceptual issues, perhaps established by a state of affairs that may seem fixed or intractable, but could be made even more problematic, probably through the operations of thought, but not pure thought. And then when these state of affairs were elevated to the status of a problem for thought, they could then be turned against the very state of affairs that established them, as well as the notion of a state solution that would do away with them. I do not mean to be abstract here, as these are meant to be very tangible things, like the violence against women, the incarceration of social desirables, the operations of the police of all kinds, and enduring structures of oppression like anti-Blackness or heteronormativity. So in Dark Deleuze, I propose that our greatest problem that we face today is not sovereign power, as would be allegorized by Nietzsche's Assault on God, nor is our worst challenge the issue of our subjective transformation, understood through Foucault's End of Humanity. Instead, I find the greatest challenge we face is, this is not my phrase that I coined, but I'd like to give it its due purpose and depth. Our problem today is the death of the world, and not a death that should be prevented, but as Nietzsche said with the death of God, it is a death, the death of the world has already happened. So second, means. If there is a hero in Anti-Oedipus, it is not the schizos, who are tragic figures whose bodies cannot handle, for one reason or another, the wild decoding and dizzying re and deterritorialization that describes the motion of capitalism. While only specific individuals stand as heroes, such as the Black Panther George Jackson, who himself suffered a tragic case of double erasure, not only in his own death at the hands of the California prison authorities, but at least in the English edition of Anti-Oedipus, his remarks lack a footnote, empty, with a number but no text. Noticing this void, both in the specific but more general, Deleuze found a hero for 1,000 Plateaus, the nomad. Cleverly subverts Gottfried Leibniz's monad, making it into a nomad, but then he takes them on an itinerant journey through lines of flight. These are all quite familiar terms for Deleuzians. But no doubt that line of flight is in dialogue with Guattari's colleague Ferdinand de Ligny, who had his own subversive lines that perhaps will come up again in this conversation. So many commentators and thinkers and users of Deleuze or Deleuze-Guattari stop there, content with images of flight that are more about flights of fancy, of individual liberty or freedom in a deeply libertine fashion, which is not to say they do not encourage this. These are their allies, those they love. But they simply take mutation, transgression, or weirdness as inspiration. Yet D&G are quite clear on what drives the nomad: war. And the operations of the nomad war are the product of a war machine. Liberals, and at least here in the US, there are a growing amount of liberal thinkers and commentators using D&G. Liberals are tempted to metaphorize this issue of war, or the problem or concept of war. Some have even gone as far as to equate its operations with left-wing liberalism, such as incorporation, legal reform, action within the state and institutions. But as a reminder, just a few pages into 1,000 Plateaus, D&G say that rhizomatics should confront the world through, quote, a guerrilla logic point of view. And this is actually the inspiration behind my next book, which I've submitted the manuscript. It takes a while for these things to be in production and to be published, but I use it as an inspiration for understanding both politics and culture in the 21st century, and trying to take the question of this guerrilla logic seriously and also evolve it to meet the new challenges of our current context. I don't have this written in my talk, but I should say that here I find great inspiration from the short-lived French collective problem approach that called itself tikkun. And they have a brief section and a longer text called "This is not a problem." And the section is called "Living and Struggling." And their argument is that living or life its own can't simply be the only approach, because those who live only to live either get reduced to mere survival, or it becomes a deeply self-indulgent practice. But then one should not only struggle as well, as we know of those dour militants that Guattari was so critical of, both in a practical problem that if one hardens themselves into an army or an extreme militant, one will simply be immediately liquidated by one's opposition, likely the state. And the question of means that I'm addressing here, that if one is too militant in their opposition, they make themselves into the tragedy of the 20th century, at least for the left, which is war communism, such as the Soviet or the early Chinese approach, but also the Cuban, in which their social horizon becomes purely determined by a way of life that, instead of freeing the social elements that are of concern, they incarcerate them just as much. So instead, what one has to do is build a coincidence between living and struggling that allows for both to function in a way without giving in too much to pure living or pure struggle. So that's maybe a start at that. What I want to ask is, how do we take seriously D&G's nomadic war machine and guerrilla logic point of view? And here I will say, perhaps it begins, like the problematic does, taking on issues of life and death, where actual lives hang in the balance. But rather than thinking or approaching them like a state, which is to say, in an attempt to find a solution, a complete, a universal, a repeatable and extensive solution, to instead take these issues of life and death and identify a vulnerability to be exploited, to use the language of hacking, to make them into a local or regional concern that somehow through contagion or circulation expands. So we've discussed the problem, we've discussed means, and finally, let me remark on style. There's something remarkable about Deleuze in his thinking that can be either exciting, distressing, or perhaps a helpful, exciting combination of both to many readers. He remained consistent throughout all of his writing. And it was a consistency that he held even as he wrote books on very different thinkers and theorists. And within these books, he systematized their thought, but each one in a very unique way. And moreover, this consistency sustained even as he used new discourse in each book, which is to say his language, or I would even say that he carried similar concepts across these books while at the same time draping them with different signs in each, sort of semiological transformation or shift. And if we're to map this within the schema of 1,000 Plateaus, for instance, we would say he developed a consistency, a plane of consistency, rather than a plan of coherence. And the purpose for Deleuze himself was quite clear. As he once said, he wanted to create concepts that were, quote, rigorous, but anexact, A-N-E-X-A-C-T, anexact, which is to say concepts that would change in their encounter with problems. But there's also an unintended consequence to Deleuze's changing nomenclature. It makes commentary on his work exceptionally difficult. Commentators are forced to explain, re-explain, describe, outline, deepen, clarify his concepts to meet sort of dictates of things like academic writing, with texts that were intentionally elusive or evasive, not to obscure, but to maintain a sense of the underdetermined within Deleuze's text itself. And rather than utilizing this indeterminate status, they try and anchor it, lock it down, limit it. Many first-time readers of Deleuze express being confounded by this writing. But the response should not be the opposite, and perhaps it's a bit mean of me to say, but I often feel just as perplexed by commentators writing on Deleuze who want to deaden his corpse or turn his words to ash. So the way out of this, perhaps, is to look at his approach anew, I think, rather than explain him to death or foolishly imitate his words or style. I think he calls for us to respond to his thought creatively. Though creative itself is a bit vague as a word. So to use the Deleuzian jargon, perhaps it is for us to singularize ourselves in response. I would put this in my terms, to develop our own unimitable style, to destroy mimesis, to not repeat someone else's words, or in that famous line that everyone loves from Deleuze, he says, if you find yourself in another's dream, which of course is a joke for him, I think, on phenomenology or intersubjectivity or psychoanalysis of the other, but he says if you find yourself in the dream of the other, you're fucked. It's over. So what would it mean to singularize, to approach creatively or create an unimitable style? For me, this means reading him like a saxophonist or studying 1,000 plateaus like a hacker. It means perhaps a transversal connection, but it means the whole act of interpretation or response is not to understand or even to repeat, but it means to develop one's own response that might not even be immediately intelligible. So certainly there are pitfalls to this approach, but it also means evaluating thought on very different terms. Instead of thinking like a commentator whose virtues are fidelity or truth to the original author, means instead thinking in terms of style, in which its categories are the creative, the compelling, the virtuoso, or the affecting. This is all to say that catching a line of flight from the inspiration of the original author, the intensity, turning it into a war machine, both in terms of a destructive path, but a way to the outside, lodging itself as a problem, not to resolve or offer a solution, but instead to make it so pressing it cannot be ignored. And all of this against something of serious consequence, those things that make the world intolerable. So bringing these three things together, the problem, the means, and the style, hopefully this is what Dark Deleuze does as a project. But to survive, it certainly shouldn't be one book or my book. We don't need just one, we need 1,000 or 1 billion more approaches, all of them creative, all of them understanding the notion of conflict in a contemporary sense, and all issuing themselves as a provocation, as a problem, rather than as a solution. Those are my initial remarks today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. Well, what I can say, it's very risky to have the first question, because it's very difficult to have the first question, because I am under a, it's not a very Deleuzian word, under a spell. I'm affected in a way. Deleuze doesn't speak very much for love, only 3 novellas, if I remember well, for courtly love. But if there is such a thing as a hatred for this word, it's, from the other hand, it's the love and care of this word, which isn't the bourgeois meaning of love, but is exactly what you pointed before, are as the singularity of oneself, which is a way to offer oneself to the collective, to offer oneself as exactly it is. And we know very much that in the activism, what is really needed is exactly that. Probably in parties like the Communist Party, is very important to have a common frame, but in autonomia and in operaism, this exactly this singularize of oneself is a more important thing. So I accept that I'm affected. I accept that I hear things that they weren't. I didn't understand probably, but I didn't notice in the book, although I translated with Yanis, with Panagiotis Tritsibidas, new things new things today, new notions. Probably it was a brilliant idea to invite you and have you here. And if you permit me, I will put. Although I'm affected, I'm from the other hand, and I'm very. I want to offer myself in this conversation as a paradigm, and I want to put the first question, which doesn't resonate with the new notions that you give us today, but are very important for people here in Greece. So I hear this presentation as an answer to phrases like the melancholy of the left, or you are the romantic leftovers of the revolutionary utopia of the 70s and 50s. And although I'm aged and I can belong to both groups, I can say that we don't feel at all, we find all those tactics as reactionary. And what exactly give, what if one say, stop in this point, Chloe, and say a word, what really Andrew gave to you and brought to you is the word dignity. We can have our dignity. We can have again our dignity, and we can say without hesitation that there is no revolution if it's not here and now. There is no revolution if it's not here and now. If it's not here and now, it's never and nowhere. This is a point to stand on. From the other hand, every sociality that the human being has subordinated to one particular privatized and individualized form must be abolished. So my question is targeted in that exactly notion of labor. What we can do on labor? How must we be strategic? Must we have a strategy for revolution? Must we turn to multiplicities to make cracks, to multiply the cracks, to leave the cracks to go together, the one to the other? And so my question is a kind of anti-politics and anti-strategic, because we don't want to make the game, to play the game in the state. Andrew said that before. The state, it's not only an organization, but is a state of affair that goes deeply in ourselves, in our unconscious, in our passive formation of our unconscious. And the most important thing is exactly to have a revolutionary, collective unconscious in the place of the capitalistic unconscious. So I will give a short translation in Greek, and I ask if Andrew, you prefer to have all 4 questions and then answer to them all, or you will answer one by one? I don't know what you prefer. What is more easy for you?
If you all feel that you have the time and the space to do it one by one, I think that would be the way to give each one its true.
So, για όσους δεν έχουν ευκολία στα αγγλικά, η συζήτηση, η εισαγωγή του αγαπητού Andrew άρχισε με το ωραίο παράδειγμα της βιβλιοθήκης του Μπόρχες και έβαλε τα βασικά ντελεζιανά θέματα, virtual απέναντι σε actual, molar απέναντι στο molecular, έβαλε αυτό τον κανόνα. Από την άλλη μεριά έφερε το θέμα του κανόνος της χαράς, the joy canon, απέναντι σε ένα κανόνα of sobriety, of the darkness, and επίσης έβαλε τα προβλήματα της προτασιακής λογικής και σκέψης, μίλησε για το θάνατο αυτού του κόσμου. If there is a death for this world, probably we should think as Spinoza and Deleuze and Culp propose, excuse me for the interruption, they propose us to think that death instinct as a part of life. And when we speak of the destruction of that world, of the death of that world, is already in the notion of restarting of this world, because death is a restarting of life. So he gave us that brilliant way to think on that point. Και η ερώτηση που του έκανα εγώ αφορούσε τον τρόπο που θα πρέπει να κινητοποιήσουμε την επανάσταση, αν θα βάλουμε τις διαδικασίες μέσα σε μια στρατηγική ή θα τη βάλουμε σε πολλαπλασιαζόμενα ρήγματα που θα δημιουργηθούν. Αυτή ήταν η ερώτησή μου. Θα έχετε βέβαια την λεπτομερή μετάφραση όλοι στο κείμενο, στην ομάδα, και πριν δώσω το λόγο στον αγαπητό Andrew, να πω ότι θα ήθελα να έχουμε και μια πέμπτη ερώτηση, αν το επιθυμεί, από τον co-translator, τον Παναγιώτη Τριτσιμπίδα. Andrew, it's to you.
Thank you so much, Chloe. And at the heart of the question you pose, I think it returns to, but perhaps it's not reuseful to, an issue of organization. And no doubt, organization is something that deeply concerned the collaboration of Deleuze-Guattari. That's, of course, why they discuss so much the organ without bodies, because it serves as a sort of metaphor for organization that they pull through so many different registers. You know, they're interested in organic metaphors, which they dislike. You know, that's why they moved to Artaud's body without organs. But they're also interested in thinking about wholes, and they dislike this classic issue of the one and the many that returns to the whole or the totality. Sometimes, even in its most ambitious ways, they dislike Althusser and Balibar on even on an ensemble. There's some ways that they tried to look to the prevailing sciences of the time. One way of reading the molecular unconscious that I think is less conventional in the literature, but I think that is quite important, is that there was a chemical revolution going on at the time in which psychiatrists were synthesizing molecules for the first time. And so I think that moves to a sort of material dimension, but there was also cybernetics and these other things. Simondon on trans-individuation from the biological to the psychic. But I think you make the stakes much more clear by connecting it to the political, making an issue of revolution, a revolution that is not meant to fall into the reactions of the 50s or the 70s, something that still thinks through labor. And I like your connection to autonomia. And I think that for me, the two notes of inspiration that I would like to connect it to are first the avant-garde. I think Deleuze truly is a high modernist. I think that he inherits these questions of the avant-garde without reducing it to the historical questions that the avant-garde responded to themselves, in which revolution was creative, it was individual, it was artistic, it pushed just as much against the symbolic as the material. It was truly an innovation in thought and life. And there remain trends that bring up the avant-garde. For instance, in the United States, there were anarcho-surrealists that came to life in the 1960s that are still writing today through poetry and action and other approaches. But then I think the other piece that I make my own is I connect it to very ultra-contemporary movements like the Black Bloc, anti-fascism, anti-capitalism, hacking on the internet, net-based culture. And it's even more confusing because I think the information society incredibly accelerated some of the trends that D&G were looking at and could only speculate about in terms of capitalism being reduced to this abstract code that held no meaning, to taking over territories, then moving and shifting quite quickly. And I'm not sure we've yet come to grips with the organizational question, but I think the way to ask it, or at least the way I propose, is that while we had been thinking through rhizomatics previously, that was a great contribution at the beginning of 1,000 Plateaus. I think we need to instead look to the way in which something like rhizomatics have been picked up in fields and disciplines from military strategy to others where it has become dominant. So I think the new paradigm is one of asymmetry, in which there's a consideration of forms. What are the dominant forms today, and what are the unexpected or vulnerabilities within those forms? And so, like you bring up that 3 novellas plateau, it goes through 3 figures of revolution that I think are quite important. The first, the break, which is what might be tied to the old Marxist-Leninist approach to seizing a state and the organs of the state and redirecting those organs for a clean break between one social system and another. There's, of course, the crack, which is tied to Fitzgerald's alcoholism and the crack up. But I think that's close to what R.D. Laing would call a breakdown. And I think that the third one, the rupture, is what interests me. And of course, it's quite elusive within that text, what precisely is meant by a rupture. But I like what you're proposing here too, where there's no separation between means and ends. This has me thinking of Agamben, despite my metaphysical and other disagreements with him. And it has me thinking as well about understanding revolutions in the present, because to wait for some long off revolution or to hold it as some sort of hope or possibility makes it too theological, it makes it religious, it makes it a commitment in the Christian sense that Nietzsche would say turns us to resentful or living in some sort of world of fantasy. So hopefully that begins to address your really deep and searching question.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And Dana, θέλεις να συνεχίσεις εσύ?
Φυσικά. Thank you, Andrew, so much. And I'm also very happy to see all of you here. To my opinion, Dr. Deleuze redefines our readings on Deleuze and very eloquently repositions Deleuze where he should have stayed in the first place, the political. We have talked about this already. I really liked your approach today and the way you talked about the problem, the means, and the style. I will focus for my question on the problem, the death of the world and the hatred. To embrace the cruelty of destructive creation is a suggestion of Dark Deleuze, resonating also with Bakunin's The Passion for Destruction is a Creative Passion. And reestablishing hatred for the world as a necessary prerequisite of the death of the world, the problem as you measured today, as hatred was necessary for the death of God and the death of man in other historical and political contexts. So, Andrew, I wanted to ask, you mentioned at some point in Dark Deleuze, and I quote, "Never believe that darkness will suffice to save us." which reminds us what D&G were saying, never believe that a line of light will suffice to save us. So I wanted to ask, is darkness a line of light aiming at the destruction of the world? And would this destruction, to your opinion, come as a Deleuzian non-battle? The realization that the world is trembling and we cynically pass by its dying body and not try to save it? Or you think that there could be also other tactics or strategies to follow? Just a short summary in Greek as well. Ο Άντριου μίλησε για το βιβλίο του, τοποθετώντας το ενδιαφέρον σε 3 θέματα: το πρόβλημα, τα μέσα και το στυλ. Το δικό μου ενδιαφέρον, αυτό που επιλέγω να συνοψίσω από την ομιλία του Άντριου και κυρίως από το έργο του, είναι το πρώτο, το πρόβλημα, και κυρίως το μίσος. Το μίσος εμφανίζεται στον Σκοτεινό Ντελέζ σαν έναν αντίβαρο στη θετικότητα στην οποία υποκείμεθα. Και παράλληλα, ο Σκοτεινός Ντελέζ προτείνει να ακολουθήσουμε το υπόγειο μονοπάτι της πίστης μέσα από τη διαδικασία του γίγνεσθε ενεργό, χωρίς να δεχόμαστε την πραγματικότητα και τις διαρρυθμίσεις εξουσίας της, αλλά να παρεμβαίνουμε σε αυτήν και να την καταστρέφουμε. Και αυτή η καταστροφική ορμή για τον κόσμο προαπαιτεί το μίσος γι' αυτόν. Όχι την επιθυμία να τον παραλλάξουμε ή να τον πολεμήσουμε από μέσα, αλλά να τον καταστρέψουμε εντελώς. Είναι ένα πολύ σύγχρονο αίτημα για έναν κόσμο που καταστρέφει και αυτοκαταστρέφεται. Μια καταστροφή που συνδέεται και με τη δημιουργία στο βιβλίο του Άντριου και δεν έρχεται από την άρνηση της πραγματικότητας, αλλά από την κατάφαση μιας άλλης πραγματικότητας, που είναι εφικτή μέσα από την καταστροφή, και εδώ μας θυμίζει και τον Μπακούνιν και το δημιουργικό πάθος για την καταστροφή. Και η δημιουργία αυτή έρχεται και ως αντίβαρο της επιβεβλημένης έξωθεν και έσωθεν δημιουργικότητας. Από τα έξω προς τα μέσα, καθώς μας επιβάλλεται από τις διαρρυθμίσεις εξουσίας, εντείνοντας το άγχος μας, μια παραγωγικότητα που οφείλουμε να υπομείνουμε με χαμόγελο και με θετική σκέψη, και από τα μέσα προς τα έξω, καθώς η εξουσία θέτει εντός μας ένα διαρκώς υψηλότερο στόχο, ώστε να καταλήγουμε να γινόμαστε εξουσιαστές του εαυτού μας, όπως λένε και οι Deleuze-Guattari. Αυτή λοιπόν η πλευρά της καταστροφικής δημιουργίας απαιτεί μίσος για τον κόσμο, προκειμένου να δημιουργηθεί το νέο και να έρθει ο θάνατος του κόσμου, το πρόβλημα, από το τρίπτυχο που χρησιμοποίησε σήμερα ο Andrew Culp, όπως παλιότερα συντελέστηκε η καταστροφή του Θεού και η καταστροφή του ανθρώπου σε άλλα ιστορικά και πολιτικά συγκείμενα. Η ερώτησή μου στον Άντριου ξεκινούσε από τη φράση του στο βιβλίο, στον Σκοτεινό Ντελέζ, «Μην πιστέψετε ποτέ ότι αρκεί το σκοτάδι να μας σώσει», που ομοιάζει με το Deleuze-Guattariανό «Μην πιστέψετε ποτέ ότι αρκεί μια γραμμή φυγής να μας σώσει». Και τον ρώτησα αν είναι λοιπόν το σκοτάδι μια γραμμή φυγής προς την καταστροφή αυτού του κόσμου, και αν αυτή η καταστροφή έρχεται μέσα από μια ντελεζιανή μη μάχη. Βλέπουμε δηλαδή τον κόσμο να σπαρταράει, ας πούμε, και προσπερνάμε χωρίς να προσπαθήσουμε να τον σώσουμε, ή υπάρχουν άλλες τακτικές ή στρατηγικές που μπορούμε να ακολουθήσουμε? This was my translation.
Thank you for the question. I'll make a brief political remark, discuss philosophy, then hopefully return to the politics, which is really the heart of the matter. I came to the death of the world by a piece by the amazing Deleuze commentator, Greg Flaxman, who has a chapter of his book on Deleuze and the Fabulation of Thought, on sci-fi, PHI, a sort of play on not science fiction, but science philosophy. And he proposes these 3 deaths, and he goes into a sort of Kantian register with it very quickly. But at that time, I was seeing this graffiti showing up in France, and is "Another end of the world is possible," playing off that anti-globalization slogan, "Another world is possible." And I found it so perfect, because you know, "Another world is possible" was thought initially through D&G. We want a world where many worlds are possible, and people very quickly move to Isabel Stengers, Hart Negri. They're all thinkers that seem to sort of appeal to D&G for this. And my initial public political formation was through this sort of return of autonomy, this anti-globalization period, and I found it quite compelling. But I felt it was hitting and coming to some limits. And of course, it ended prematurely with the beginning of the War on Terror and 9/11. It's sort of very cruel appearance of a sort of the third world fighting back against the first, and somehow the anti-globalization gets derailed. And so this notion that another end of the world is possible sort of repeated a lot of these earlier concepts that I'd taken for granted, or that had really sedimented, or had sort of, I'd come to take for granted the conventional interpretation of them. It started opening a portal to a new way of thinking, to understand why the youth and the young people of the world felt so depressed and apocalyptic, and why images of death and destruction could be circulated, but hopefully not in a passive and debilitating resignation. There's also been a rise of nihilistic thinking that I think is worth considering and reading, most notably Eugene Thacker's Infinite Resignation, but it's ultimately not my line of thought. And so how do I begin with this death of the world? I think it's ultimately, it's not reducible to a question of metaphysics, but it can easily be apprehended through metaphysics, in the sense that what are the schemas in which we ask our questions and come up with tentative procedures or systems? Of course, this was, for Nietzsche, initially a question of God that is virtually incomprehensible to most thoughtful atheists these days, which I would imagine many of you are. And so the question of, is there a God that motivated even German idealism and the great Feuerbach and Hegelian sort of questions, you know, those are perhaps done and over, though no doubt some Marxists would want to disagree with me. And I think that there's still a trend to think through the human in Foucault's sense, the sort of birth of the human through the human sciences, this obsession of the replacement with God by the human as the object of inquiry. And its sort of primary concern is then questions of subjective transformation, which I think are still quite prescient, given that society acts as a sort of subjective machine for the production of anthropology. Heideggerians here are quite critical of it in an interesting way, I suppose. But what I see is we're now in an era in which we have the production of worlds, and it's produced on an assembly line just as much as anything else. And in fact, large groups of the government are dedicated to creating images and approaches to the world. Go talk to geographers who are doing ice core drillings and telling us about climate change. And the challenge is that we're given a very specific approach to the world. And, you know, in this Kantian fashion, it's the transcendental ground for thought that they're given. And so what I see with D&G, and here I'm agreeing with Lapoujade, whose book, Aberrant Movement, I think is brilliant on this question, that we live on an earth that has been deterritorialized, or its dominant trend is deterritorialization. And so the approach that we're given so much, even as government solutions to climate change, is simply re-territorialization. The answer to resource crisis, or the answer to refugees, is re-territorialization. And so all of these issues are innately reactionary in their spirit. They shore up the old enemies that we have been fighting for so long. And so to approach or confront the death of the world, yes, there could be the passive response to sort of just walk past its decaying body. But, and I respect and appreciate some people who have a cogent way of doing that. But for me, I think it's the more ambitious project to find that there is still something intolerable about the worlds that are being presented to us. A world in lockdown, a world in which refugees are put in camps, a world in which we just keep drawing the same borders of nations to the world who then fight each other to the death. And so I think it means a metaphysical transformation as well. The death of the world means the insufficiency of the world as a category and the necessity to replace it with something else. And it's not necessarily our positive project to simply put a new image in its place. I love the work of François Zurabichvili, who himself said that the revolutionary process of dimension of Deleuze's thought is thought without an image. So that means that every image of thought or every transcendental ground that we're sort of proposed must be at least tentative, if not even something that we overcome. And that's also how he rethinks repetition. He says repetition or revolutionary change is where the future impedes on the present so much that our image of what is now, what is present, or what is the world becomes incommensurable with what happens in the future. And we're left without images at all. And I think that is absolutely brilliant. And so I would say I'm currently doing some work in Black studies that returns to that great Martinican thinker, Frantz Fanon, who likes to channel the words of his own poet mentor, Aimé Césaire, who almost in a sort of incantation says the only task worth undertaking now, and that was even 100 years ago, is the end of the world. And he means in a poetic sense, he means it in a cultural sense, he means in a political sense. And I don't think that we've yet completed that task, even though so many people have brought it up. So that's where I've been thinking, and hopefully those strands fit together for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Christo,
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Andrew. It's our honor to have you here tonight. So I have a question for you. Maybe I will say it first in English, and then, like the others, I will translate it into Greek. So I'm concerned about the thing you talked to us about, the ambivalence of concepts of Deleuze. So it's true, and many writers have talked about this. And it's true, as you say, that when we study Deleuze, we should not deprive of this movement that his concepts have. So we should, that's very interesting what you said in your talk about how we should treat them like singularities in a constant plane of creativity, as I think you said, if I'm right. So in my readings of Deleuze, I search for some dualities, the dualities of concepts, like the state machine, the war machine, creation, the positive, the negative, positivity, negativity of the movements. So, and these dualities of concepts help me to locate the movement of capital and also the movement of the minoritarian movements and the social movements, of course, that try to break down the axiomatic of capitalism and maybe create over the striated space of capitalism, create a smooth space. So I would like to ask you if you think the concepts of Deleuze and of the Deleuzian literature can offer us the plane for creating a minoritarian strategy. So here we come back to this theme that, this question that Chloe brought up earlier about organization, of course, the organization of the movements. And because if we want to talk about organization, we have to talk about structures and molar structures, which of course Deleuze himself and Deleuze-Guattari say that they are, we must have structures, molar structures, in order to survive. So, because we can't always be in a constant movement and a constant line of flight, of course, we need the molar structures. But you personally, do you think that the modern movements have the ability, which function, as you said, in a rhizomatic way, rhizomatically? Do you think they have the ability to escape from the control, from the axiomatic of capitalism, and especially the appropriation of the state machine? And what's for you maybe one path for in this movement? That's my question. I know there is not a definite answer, but it's something I wanted to ask you a long time since I read your book. And so now I will translate into Greek. Θα πω και στα ελληνικά, γιατί αυτά που είπε είναι και κάποια σημεία της ίδιας της εισήγησης του Άντριου, όπου μας μίλησε για την αμφιθυμία των όρων του Ντελέζ και για το ότι κάποιοι μελετητές τους είτε παγιώνουν τελείως αυτές τις έννοιες και τις δίνουν μονοσήμαντα, το οποίο για τον Άντριο είναι μεγάλο λάθος, αλλά είπε ότι, αν κατάλαβα καλά, εξίσου λάθος είναι και το αντίθετο ακριβώς, το να τις αφήνουμε έρμεα των ερμηνεών, χωρίς να υπάρχει καμία σταθερή βάση και να βρίσκονται σε μια συνεχή κίνηση που στο τέλος καταλήγει να μην έχει ίδια νόημα. Γι' αυτό πρότεινε να τις βλέπουμε καλύτερα τις έννοιες σαν ενικότητες μέσα σε ένα πλαίσιο πάντα δημιουργικότητας. Αυτό που είπα είναι ότι εγώ προσωπικά εντοπίζω κάποια δίπολα στη σκέψη των Deleuze-Guattari, τα οποία με βοηθούν να καταλάβω και το πλαίσιο λειτουργίας του καπιταλισμού και της εξωματικής του καπιταλισμού, για την οποία μιλούν οι Deleuze-Guattari, όσο και επίσης να εντοπίσω και την κίνηση των μενωτικών κινήσεων που δημιουργούνται μέσα από τα σύγχρονα κινήματα και όχι μόνο, τα οποία προσπαθούν να διαρρήξουν αυτό ακριβώς την αξιωματική του καπιταλισμού. Και η ερώτηση προς τον Άντριου είναι, αυτές οι έννοιες που προσφέρει ο Ντελέζ θεωρεί ότι μπορούν να ξεφύγουν, μπορούν να οδηγήσουν στη δημιουργία μιας μειονοτικής στρατηγικής, μια στρατηγική που βοηθάει στη δημιουργία μειονοτικών κινήσεων δηλαδή. Και έτσι φτάνω πάλι στο ερώτημα που έθεσε και πριν η Χλόη για την οργάνωση. Γιατί για να μιλήσουμε για οργάνωση πρέπει να αναφερθούμε αναγκαστικά σε δομές και σε γραμμομοριακά σύνολα, τα οποία για τους Ντελέζ και Γκαταρί, το λένε και στο Μιλ Πλατό και σε άλλα βιβλία τους, είναι απαραίτητα για την επιβίωση. Δεν μπορεί να υπάρξει μια συνεχής κίνηση χωρίς να στέκεται πουθενά. Και γι' αυτό κατέληξα στην ερώτηση, άμα θεωρείται προσωπικά τα σύγχρονα κινήματα που λειτουργούν ριζωματικά, όπως είπε και ο ίδιος, μπορούν να διαφύγουν από τον έλεγχο, την αξιωματική και κυρίως την οικειοποίηση της κρατικής μηχανής. So, Andrew?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question about politics, strategy, and a relationship to the present, or the dominant way of things. Maybe as a point of access, I would first think back to this early encounter between Deleuze and Guattari, in which Deleuze is writing on Guattari's own approach to subjected groups. I don't remember the precise moment of it, but maybe it was even written either during or before Anti-Oedipus, as one of their earliest sort of encounters. And of course, I think most people here will know, but it's worth repeating, Guattari, having come through sort of Trotskyite and youth political movements in his own youth, decides he wants to become a psychiatrist, but gets bored with it, never really finishes college, bums around a little bit, and then ends up reconnecting with the brother to one of his high school teachers to live on this post-psychiatric commune just right outside Paris, in which they engage in a utopian experiment of living together and having people with even quite acute cases take on as much work as they're able to, and rotating it, and all of these sort of like new left commune-centric ideas of life together. And so in his writing about groups and the function of political groups, he brings both this personal experience of living in this commune-like setting, his political motivations of these groups that agitated often against Eurocommunism, against Stalinization, against the colonialism in Algeria. And he mentions a few very interesting things that Deleuze sort of draws out. I think this is the beginning of their rethinking of the death drive. They say, death is productive. Many groups continue to exist far past their own utility and purpose, because the people involved simply mindlessly reproduce themselves, because they take that on as simply the task of survival, which I think is an excellent description of many groups that all of us have been a part of, but especially political groups who maintain ideologies that are decades, if not centuries, out of date. And so we already have this sort of question of the timeliness of ideas, of political practices, of concepts, and D&G's insistence that often what doesn't work should simply be done away with. And their idea with the death drive, like Chloe had mentioned previously, is that when we get rid of something, we shouldn't be worried that everything disappears and like a sort of the worst forms of nihilism, life itself or the world or whatever ceases, but instead other things will fill in its place. And so there's a sort of, I guess, a belief or a confidence that will, you know, despite as much as we kill in terms of death or undermine, that there's this active, dynamic, passive creation that always sort of continues. Now, in terms of the strategies of how to assess current political movements and their approaches, you know, when I was first theorizing anarchism, maybe 10, 15 years ago, I thought of 3 different political approaches. And it's artificial that I'm limiting it to 3, but hopefully this schematic approach is helpful. And so I think there are very traditional Leninist approaches, as I mentioned before, seizing the organs of what one imagines to be molar organizations or organisms and redirecting them for their purposes, you know, the classic dictatorship of the proletariat. I won't even bother criticizing it because we already know how that goes. But then I think that there are 2 different approaches that often define how we approach radical politics today. One of them is extreme autonomy. And these are people who engage in withdrawal to the point of escape to set up separate communities, communes that are completely away from everything else, people who want to abolish the division of labor, and so they teach themselves how to do everything to become self-sufficient. These old, at least in the United States, romantic ideas of Thoreau living on Walden Pond or living in a shack. And though, of course, this has interesting connections to, let's say, the Heideggerians as well, you know, with Heidegger himself moving to Black Forest to put on some peasant clothes and cut wood in his small cabin. But there are many anarchists who do this. And it sometimes goes under the term of anti-civilization as just a catch-all term for modernity and development. And there are all kinds of experiments in living in which they undertake. I'm less interested in that approach, though I do think there are ways in which that can still be helpful. Instead, I'm more interested in the trends that have gone under the name illegalism, piracy, the Russian nihilists, people who engaged in regicides and attentates. I don't mean to glorify the violence associated with it, but it's people who live lives that were wild, that did not meet the institutional restrictions of what were imposed in them, but instead of seeking complete refuge, found a compromise with their situations and turned it into some sort of conflict. The non-battle that Dana mentions, which is not a head-on conflict, which will always sort of nearly always result in immediate liquidation, but some sort of unexpected singular relationship of conflict that creates a way of life that they want to inhabit, and that they get joy out of precisely that conflict itself, rather than seeking its resolution in some sort of long term as well. And so these were anarchists who often were called the wild so-and-so, or you know, people whose lives maybe were documented or weren't, people who turned their life into almost a way of art. And that this is systematized through something like the cultural wing of Autonomia, like in Bologna. But Nicholas Thoburn, who's written on some Deleuze as well, also calls it cramped spaces. He attributes this back to Deleuze, I believe. Say that a cramped space is where you find yourself within the space itself. And so it's not looking at a complete escape. Now, I want to very quickly just say that I want to distinguish it a little bit from Foucault's approach, because I think that there's a interesting agreement and disagreement in the sort of schema of D&G versus Foucault. So for Foucault, there's always power and resistance is not a dialectical sort, but resistance is always brought about by power, but it almost seems like they're locked in conflict, which is why in like his Subjects and Power essay, he talks about it in terms of agonism. And the problem that I have with that is I think it very easily turns into a form of liberal democracy in which there's this idea of a very boisterous disagreement and debate suddenly being the purpose. And so it once again returns to this long off horizon that can always be forestalled, where there's just, if there's enough sort of elements of disagreement or difference, then it almost provides the motor itself. And, you know, there are theorists of that, but I wouldn't call myself one. And instead, D&G provide a three-part model in 1,000 Plateaus, in the nomadology, of course, going across those two great plateaus, in which they say, actually, perhaps the state itself is the dialectic, or dialectics describes the precise operations and movement of the state. They do this from a funny sort of rereading of Dumézil. And they say, you know, it has an authoritarian and has a liberal permissive pole, and they work together in a strange, often unspoken complementarity. And so the great challenge of leftist movements is they sometimes simply become a liberal pole of the state, that then works hand in hand with the authoritarian one. It's not to say that various factions don't win out for long periods of time, but they find themselves in cooperation. Whereas the nomad somehow is outside the state, completely outside the state in a certain way. And maybe this does give rise to this primitivist, commune, complete outside way of life. Maybe I'm thus in slight disagreement with D&G with the strategy, but for them, then the great task is to avoid being drawn into a dialectical conflict with the state. And that's precisely how one succeeds. But while doing so, it's not simply this operation of evasion, it's also doing so creatively, producing a way of life in the process, expanding or thinking of new forms of deterritorialization that keep driving things sort of forward. And so I think that that's sort of where I find myself. And so hopefully I gave some practical sort of notions, but then a more sort of abstract pattern. And I'd say, I think this sort of more illegalist way of life where people disregard the law, challenge and confront the law, create lives worth living for themselves in an almost artistic sense, I think broadly characterizes what I see as the productive way forward.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Ευχαριστούμε.
Amazing.
Χάρη, θέλεις
Amazing,
τη σειρά σου.
Thank you so much for this, Andrew, and thank you for your talk. My question will be the last one from the four of us, and then we'll open up to a broader group discussion. And we already have two questions going for when the discussion opens. The first one is by Yannis Lauzeos, and the second one is by Nikos Haralabopoulos. So starting off with my question, I think it's interesting because if we again follow the structure of your talk, I think Dana asked about the problem, but then the rest of us asked about the means. And myself, I'm going to ask about the means as well. So a key point that I find in your work is the idea that neoliberalism can easily recuperate some key concepts of Deleuze-Guattari, namely concepts like joy, connection, lightness, positivity, transformation. All of these prominently feature in the neoliberal discourse of flexibility, fluidity, and dynamism. For this and for other reasons, Andrew has proposed that radical politics should perhaps depart from these notions and seek darker tools and weapons, such as hatred, negativity, and destruction. Nevertheless, I wonder whether, Andrew, whether you do not agree that neoliberalism can only maintain these Deleuzian concepts in its ideology, rather than in its concrete and material operation. In other words, one could argue that in its concrete manifestations, neoliberalism proves just as heavy, negative, static, sad, and hateful as pre-neoliberal capital. Given then this inconsistency between neoliberal ideology and reality, would it not be correct to say that some radical potential remains in the original, lighter, recuperable Deleuzian concepts? And indeed, the potential to fight neoliberalism in its real and material manifestations rather than its own discourse. So a quick translation in Greek and of course then the answer. Ευχαριστώ πολύ τον Άντρου για την ομιλία του. Ουσιαστικά ένα βασικό σημείο το οποίο υπάρχει στην σκέψη του είναι ότι ο νεοφιλελευθερισμός μπορεί εύκολα να αφομοιώσει κάποιες έννοιες των Deleuze-Guattari και συγκεκριμένα έννοιες όπως η χαρά, η συνδεσιμότητα, η ελαφρότητα, η θετικότητα, η μεταμόρφωση. Όλες αυτές οι έννοιες χρησιμοποιούνται από την νεοφιλελεύθερη ιδεολογία, από τον νεοφιλελεύθερο λόγο, καθώς αυτός δίνει έμφαση στην ευελιξία, την ρευστότητα, τον δυναμισμό. Για αυτόν και για άλλους λόγους, ο Άντριου υποστηρίζει ότι η ριζοσπαστική πολιτική πρέπει να απομακρυνθεί από αυτές τις έννοιες και να αναζητήσει πιο σκοτεινά εργαλεία και όπλα, όπως το μίσος, η αρνητικότητα και η καταστροφή. Παρ' όλα αυτά, αναρωτιέμαι, και η ερώτηση που του θέτω είναι: δεν συμφωνεί ο Άντριου ότι ενώ ο νεοφιλελευθερισμός κρατάει αυτές τις ντελεζιανές έννοιες στην ιδεολογία του, δεν μπορεί ποτέ να είναι πιστός σε αυτές στην πραγματική και υλική του λειτουργία? Πράγματι, θα μπορούσε κανείς να υποστηρίξει ότι στις υλικές του εκδηλώσεις ο νεοφιλελευθερισμός είναι όσο, αν όχι περισσότερο, βαρύς, αρνητικός, στατικός, λυπηρός και γεμάτος μίσος, όσο ο πρόνεο φιλελεύθερος καπιταλισμός, ο φιλελεύθερος καπιταλισμός δηλαδή. Δεδομένης αυτής της ασυνέπειας ανάμεσα στην νεοφιλελεύθερη ιδεολογία από τη μία και στην νεοφιλελεύθερη πραγματικότητα από την άλλη, δεν θα ήταν σωστό να πούμε ότι παραμένει μια ριζοσπαστική δύναμη στις αρχικές, ελαφρύτερες, αφομοιώσιμες ντελεζιανές έννοιες? Μια δύναμη μάλιστα που μπορεί να πολεμήσει τον νεοφιλελευθερισμό στην πραγματικότητα και όχι μόνο στην ιδεολογία και στον λόγο του. Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Andrew, that was a translation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. You ask a question that I think is at the heart of debates in Western Marxism, so-called Western Marxism, certainly all Marxism, but sort of it's been crystallized in those intellectual formations. And I'd say that the one contribution of the French tradition, which this is coming through, is different than, let's say, the German tradition's response here. And so it's worth sort of considering the contrast between the two. In the German tradition, I'm thinking here of the Frankfurt School, but there are many others. We tend to get this image of capitalism as a homogenizing process that creates dullness and repetition of the same. And we see this in popular critiques of consumer culture that are quite popular today, where they say, oh, you go to the cereal aisle and there's 1,000 boxes of cereal. How do you know which one to even buy? And what's interesting about just even, not even D&G, but the general French approach to these issues of Western Marxism is they say, or they ask, what if capitalism is constituted not by sameness, but by difference? And of course, this is where capitalism becomes liberal, or it becomes supercharged or weaponized liberalism, especially through the 1970s. You know, this happens in part due to the collapse of Bretton Woods. There are a lot of historical examples. Its new relationship to debt and consumer markets. And I think there's still debates over whether capitalism really is sameness or difference. I think that its structural conditions remain sort of rather determined, a particular relationship between land, labor, and capital, and the necessity of producing, surplus labor as profit in order to have increasingly imperialistic circuits of exploitation. But anyway, that gets quite Marxological. I think the interesting dynamic that D&G pick up on, which is what they put at the core of the capitalist axiomatic as they define it, is this moment of the Communist Manifesto in which Marx and Engels describe the ambivalent character of capital. And this is so important to understand chapter 3, the anthropology chapter of Anti-Oedipus, where they say that capitalism undermines, on the one hand, which they see as a useful process, but it reestablishes itself on the other hand. And the way in which Marxists traditionally talk about this is they say capitalism socializes labor while privatizing profit. It's slightly different in this formulation here. But, there are many capitalists or many Marxists who say the idea that capitalism socializes the production process is not necessarily bad. Of course, state socialists would raise this to a sort of incredible, challenging, frustrating, disgusting attempt, at least from those of us who are anti-work. But they'd say the fact that people work together on an assembly line and they get to know each other and trust each other and depend on each other for their safety and their future means that those are the conditions for unionizing to begin with. To know your neighbor, to need your neighbor, to have known them and their family for 10 years. And so one of the great challenges with neoliberalism is labor gets reorganized in a way in which it becomes so flexible and so unruly and chaotic. You have many people who never even get to know their coworkers, let alone their supervisor. Those who drive for Uber and Lyft get in a car and follow the directions of a device that mechanically gives them directions that separate them precisely from the other drivers, which is what fundamentally makes it different from taxis and taxi drivers and having taxi unions. And so does neoliberalism connect? I would say that neoliberalism does connect. I mean, the fact that we're able to speak right now is in part due to these amazingly brilliant sort of capitalist technologies driven by, venture capitalist money. You all may know this, but Lyft and Uber, I think, are still not profitable because they're deeply subsidized by venture capitalist money that make them cheaper than taxis, not because of the going market rate of taxis being any cheaper for Uber, but because they're just flooded with billions of dollars of people trying to make it artificially cheap. So the forms of connection that we have themselves are this sort of power game being played by venture capitalists in order to reorganize our life in these new principles. And so I guess there's one question of what is the quality of these new forms of connection that we get through Facebook or Zoom, or being able to get a car to drive us nearly anywhere in a very quick amount of time. What is the form of joy connected to it? I think that emotional labor is being extracted from people at an extraordinary rate. Anything from surveillance technology that requires workers to be smiling on the job, to forms of care work, being like nursing and caring for the elderly or the sick, being increasingly farmed out to people rather than in a community. And I think DNG's gambit was to say they neither want an old return to community that was constituted through family and blood and land, nor do they want the capitalist technologies that give us a very limited way of connecting to each other. And they had this very utopian idea that other deeper or more challenging forms of connection and joy could be found. And maybe it's just a question of disposition or strategy for me, but I'm less likely to say, let's find unexpected capacities in Zoom to create connections we would have never found before. And I'm much more likely to think of what are the unexpected capacities of Zoom that we can find to screw with people and to hack and to find vulnerabilities and to exploit them. And maybe this simply comes down to a question of strategy, but I think that it's a mentality that is, maybe it existed in DNG's time with people who were, I mean, because we've always had scammers and cheats and people like that, but I think it's been made political in a way that we haven't seen for a while, or at least that we have a new era of a political form of finding vulnerabilities, exploiting them, challenging others. It's certainly gotten quite bad with trolls and spam farms and things over elections. But I think that we have one or two ways of sort of doing this, to sort of find our own way or try and find the joyous way through these, or to say, if our enemies are finding these really brilliant exploits through chat apps and through the internet and through memes, then it's our job to indulge ourselves in the process, because I think we can do it just as well, if not better than them. And that there's a politics of sort of embracing the present, its materials, its culture, and finding our own sort of way in it. So I suppose it's a belief in the world, but it's also a conflict with the world.
Thank you, Andrew.
Those are mine.
Amazing answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I'm going to pass it over to Christos to conduct the discussion.
Όχι, ένα λεπτό. Δεν ξέρω αν ο Παναγιώτης Τριτσιμπίδας έχει μια ερώτηση ή αν δεν έχει, τότε θα περάσουμε στην πρώτη ερώτηση από το Γιάννη Ραουζέο. And if I may introduce him to you, Andrew, Yannis Rouzeos is an apostate because being a very prominent person, a prominent figure of Greek activism and autonomia, now is studying with Vasiliki Rousseau, Heidegger. And I wonder what kind of buggery will that can produce. So I will give you Yannis Rouzeos, and then Christos will take the questions from the YouTube and Harris the questions from the Zoom. Okay. Yannis, εσύ.
Hi, it was a very interesting presentation. Many of the people that tried to make the references before, I think they stated quite openly some very interesting remarks on how we can define the Deleuzian impact on radical action and theory. One key thing that I think also that you mentioned earlier is the idea of an image that it cannot be projected anymore through capitalism, through the notion of what capitalism reality suggests and creates in the moment. So I was wondering if we could see in the way that in some sorts Agamben sees and other theoreticians, and me myself, the idea of Heideggerian being with as a forthcoming process that can lead to an image of a radical, open, free and revolutionary society that will follow capitalism. Also, you mentioned the idea of technology. The technology is creating, and I think we can see that in all sorts of ways at the moment, a great net that blocks images and the notion of language itself all over the world and the way that we interact as minorities, as people, as societies. This technology, I think, is not just a formulation, and its acceleration doesn't have to do just with that, with the force that exists inside the core of neoliberal movement, so-called, even though the neoliberals like to say and address to us that there are only individuals and no societies. But I think the technology melding and merging quite intensely into the connection with this very certain capitalist process and the extension of the capital. This is a general block that also is blocking us for projecting other possible futures instead of a destinential future that can be formulated only under the guidance of this power, this crossover between capitalism and technology. And in my opinion, it's very close, or at least watches and preserves power to create an idea of techno-totalitarian state. We can see that in the way that this process works in China or Singapore. And we can see also some glimpses of the eyes of the ruling elites in the republics of the West. that they're watching in this kind of political statue and process that will leave behind all the liberal, let's say, concepts of law that prevent from these elites to suppress the rest of the society and rebuild a society more close to feudal states than to the early capitalist views and let's say proposals. Third thing, you mentioned, I was wondering then if you can see being with and the existential aspect of substantial ontology as a way of creating communities and societies that counter-blocking this excess and this process, this plan. This sounds very Heideggerian, but I think it's very close to how personally can I describe an anarchistic, not in the classical political way, but very deeply anarchistic way of creating and creating breaks and creating a general plan for, let's say, a new image of the world, comparing to more, let's say, minorial plans. Fourth and the last, but not the least, because I think the other people, the other friends here that we are following this seminar will have very interesting questions to address. You mentioned before Tikkun and the impact that Tikkun had, let's say, had in your work in connection with Deleuzian aspects. Because here is a Deleuzian-Guattarian general approach of how we can use the Deleuzian concepts into, let's say, a more radical approach. You also mentioned we are an image of the future. How much these issues, I mean, Tikkun from one part, and we are an image of the future, you think representing somehow your idea of how we can conduct the Deleuzian.
Γιάννη Ραουζέ, συντόμευσε λίγο για να πάρουμε και άλλες ερωτήσεις.
Okay, στο τελειώνω, ναι. How can you think we can, let's say, think that these two books are having connection with what you are saying? In We Are an Image of the Future, I'm participating the collective that wrote this book with Tassos Agris and also with the help of Peter Gunderlus and AK Press. I'm a part of the Void Network. So I would definitely like very much to listen on what you're going to say about all these aspects. Thank you.
It's time for me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Andrew,
μπορώ να κάνω και τη μετάφραση, παιδιά, αλλά μήπως θέλετε να...
Όχι, άστο Γιάννη, γιατί έχουμε πολλές ερωτήσεις.
Ωραία, άλλωστε μιλάμε όλοι αγγλικά, ναι, δεν υπάρχει.
Andrew, you can give your answer.
Great. Maybe I'm going to start with the last question because I think these transnational, international, global connections don't happen as much as they should, and I think it might be interesting for your audience as well as for me to learn and talk about as well. Here in the United States, I'm deeply involved in anarchist, broadly might be called anarchist or left communist or ultra left movements that are largely together. There's this funny phrase that some of the Invisible Committee people said in an interview that a number of my friends repeat, which is, I'm too communist for my anarchist friends and I'm too anarchist for my communist friends. And so I find myself in this sort of strange position often myself. Anarchism in the United States has a long tradition. It's the first anarchist was someone, or the first self-named anarchist was someone who went by the name Josiah Warren, who was a friend of Robert Owen, the famous utopian socialist. They met each other in the former industrial town of Cincinnati, Ohio. And Josiah Warren helped found a number of communes and communities. And this goes back 150 years. many things happened between then and now. You know, of course, hopefully many of us know the Chicago martyrs who were killed by the Chicago police after a riot for the 8-hour workday in the 19th century. This popular immigrant wave of anarchists, including many Russians like Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, but also Germans like Johann Most. There's a forgotten Italian that I really like, Luigi Galliani, who was more of the illegalist or insurrectionist, but also had a sort of workerist impulse. And then, of course, it changes with the New Left and the student movements of the 60s. And it had a resurgence again in the 1990s with the anti-globalization movement, and it ebbs and flows with so many different things. I would say that I like the youthful student aspect of anarchism, especially as it comes through punk, but the people I affiliate with most are distributed through a press that calls itself Little Black Cart and Ardent Press out of the Bay Area. They're dissident, they're weird, they're alternative. They're not about building platforms or organizations. They often create alternative ways of life. And I can provide links or resources to people if they'd like to look more of that. I read a lot of the material. I don't know why, but I have not incorporated a lot of it into my writing just yet. I have bookshelves full of their books and I read it, and I almost feel like it's a hidden secret that if I were to write too much about, somehow it would betray them because they want to stay off the grid or stay out of the academic institutions. But perhaps I'm being selfish with my approach. But I very much like them, and I see myself as building a bridge between those ideas and academia. And people in Quiver, for instance, are inspired by all and both. And so we have really sort of interesting and brilliant conversations. Going backwards, I think the question of the minoritarian and being a foreigner in one's own land, as proposed by D&G, remains paramount today. I think this is probably the core of their political project. And if it's ever forgotten or left out, and the minor and the minoritarian cease to be the center, then it quite easily can be moved to something like neoliberalism or state capitalism. And so I think you all as Greeks may experience foreignness in a very different way than I do, because I'm living in the land of the great empire, whereas you all live in a land that has been used by my country to be the birthplace of whiteness or of thought or of something like that, but always of a different people, of a different time, of a different place, and not living Greeks, who we can actually exist and have conversations with and develop all these sort of brilliant approaches and ideas. And so I think that's still a sort of connection we can have, but I think it reveals the singularization that I talked about before, which is it will be on very different terms for both of us, but that doesn't have to be a drawback. It can be a brilliant point of overlap or exploration or experimentation. In terms of the being with and technology, I think that it's interesting to bring Heidegger into the conversation. Deleuze himself didn't have a strong preference for Heidegger, discusses him very little, is ambivalent about his discussion of Heidegger in What is Philosophy? And I think he says, Heidegger was asking the right questions about the world and the earth. The only problem is he still tied it to this deeply rootedness, that brings him along this sort of Nazi expedition. And so I wonder, perhaps more so than D&G, I am very sympathetic to the critique of contemporary capitalism. It's becoming technological, or in the terms that Heidegger himself would say, cybernetic, in which it stops thinking. It allows the technicians to take over. And I think the one point of connection that has been mined so brilliantly by Bernard Stiegler has been this notion of machinic enslavement that we get in Thousand Plateaus, to say, what is the new form of subjectivity or power that happens when people don't control us through ideology and the ideological institutions of the state, like the church or the school, but they start controlling us through technical devices that become necessary for our social life. what happens when we have phones that do things that we don't know about and that shift and push and incite us in different and unexpected ways. And I'll note one thing very briefly. A post-cybernetic approach to government has become quite popular in the United States, and they call it the nudge. And it's a deeply cynical approach. They say that politics is basically how it's always going to be, in this very funny sort of Fukuyama, end of history. People are set in their preferences. It's going to be basically what it is. And the job of people who want to make social reform or social change is to subtly nudge and push, incite and provoke people to move slightly in one direction or another. And they do it through statistical techniques. They do it through modeling. They do it through very technical means like marketing and advertising. And they say that this is the new approach to creating the social. And so I think that the thing that we need to fight with when we put on our Heideggerian glasses, the lens of Heidegger, is this constant incitement and provocation at a level that is sort of out of reach to us, not because it's oppressively ideological, but because it's minute and hard to determine, and it happens 1,000 times a day. And I think that that's, for anyone having to sit on Zoom and answer emails, we already see this quite a bit, but I think that this is the technical challenge. And what might it be to be with people? I think that I agree. It might be interruption. It might be break. It might just be exploring different temporalities or different spatialities that exist outside that technical framework, or is at least partially outside of it. So we can discover new experiments that aren't overladen by those technical provocations, where we can suddenly have conversations. So that means camps or reading groups, or times where we close the door, turn off our phones, get rid of our screens, and sit with the text and see what it means to really interrogate a page, a word, a line, a paragraph. And I think that that form of inquiry is going to be even more valuable in a time in which it's trying to be taken from us. So hopefully that's the beginning of a response.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Χρήστο, θα αναλάβεις εσύ από εδώ και πέρα, αλλά παρακαλώ οι ερωτήσεις σας να είναι κάπως σύντομες, όχι τύπου Ραουζέου, και που ήταν βέβαια υπέροχη η ερώτησή του, για να μπορέσουν να ακουστούν περισσότεροι. Χρήστο, σε σένα.
Ωραία. Στη συνέχεια ήθελε και ο Πάνος να κάνει ερώτηση, αλλά είπε ότι έπρεπε να φύγει στις 9, άρα έφυγε, δυστυχώς. Και θα συνεχίσει ο Νίκος, ο Χαραλαμπόπουλος, μετά είναι ο Γιώργος Βάρσος και σήκωσε το χέρι της Κιντάνα, αν είδα καλά. Άρα δεν ξέρω αν έχει...
Όχι, εγώ χειροκρότησα απλά με reaction.
Εντάξει. Ωραία, άρα είναι ο Νίκος και ο Γιώργος συνέχεια.
Νομίζω ότι είναι και ο Γιάννης Ρήγας που έχει κάνει μια ερώτηση. Δεν ξέρω αν ο Γιάννης θέλει να ρωτήσει κάτι, ο Μπρίκης.
Είχε μια συζήτηση στο chat με τον Άντριου.
Ναι, το είδα. Μήπως θέλει να ρωτήσει κάτι.
Νομίζω πως θα απαντήσει ο ίδιος. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Νομίζω θα απαντήσει γραπτός. Ευχαριστώ.
Μπορείς να την πεις και προφορικά, αν θέλεις. Ωραία. Χρήστο, σε σένα.
Ωραία. Νίκο, μας ακούς?
Ναι, ακούω. Θα προσπαθήσω, Χλόη, να είμαι όσο πιο σύντομος γίνεται.
Δεν το είπα για σένα, αγάπη μου.
Όχι, θα προσπαθήσω και εγώ, γιατί και εγώ ξεφεύγω καμιά φορά. Andrew, thank you very much for your presentation and the wonderful discussion. I meant to ask what I'm going to ask now, since I've read your book, so I'm glad I found you here, and I hope my English is adequate enough so I can pose the question. I'll start with an example. There is a certain pattern in many sci-fi movies, especially Blade Runner 2049, which goes like this and concerns the relation between the inside and the outside of the state territory and the civil society. The inside, it's very interesting, is presented as a chaotic and dystopic space, which is not exactly inhabited by people, but it's full of a demographic mold under the iron presence of control. On the contrary, the outside is described as an infected nuclear desert inhabited by the people that are banished and ostracized, left in their lack. So there's a certain presentation, there's a certain simulacrum, we could say, that has to do with the inside and the outside. The second thing that I would like to present as an example is a very interesting book by Frank Ruda, which is called Hegel's Rabble, where he finds a blind spot in Hegel's dialectic theory of the state and the sequence of the family, the civil society, and the nation state, which is the rabble, the people that don't fit in it. And Ruda argues that this is the material cornerstone in Marxist theory, which brought the meaning of the proletariat. My question is double. First, could we say that the nowadays terms of this rabble that Ruda presents as a blind spot in Hegel's theory, which is the theory that still has to do with the notion of the state as we know it, are the residual assemblages of the queer and femme bodies concerning the family, the proletariat masses, the workforce that is, how can I say, is used or not by the civil society and its production, and the surplus population presented first and foremost by the refugees concerning the state. If these are the notions that reconstruct the relation between the inside and the outside, the second question is this: could we say that the lines of flight are, in fact, or could be the lines of connection between the fleeing inside that can not longer bear the civil society as they live it, and storming outside, which is produced by the wars of the inside? And if this is true, could we say that the modern revolutionary notion would be a notion that creates the terms of a civil war as Agaben in Stasis, or Tikkun, or even you, as I read it in Dark Deleuze, would be created by this meeting between the inside, the fleeing inside, and the storming outside? This is the question.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much for this question. I mean, I find that the inside and the outside is a really interesting topology. Of course, it's used by many different thinkers in many different ways. I think the unspoken topology of the state in D&G is the inverse of the way in which operaismo and autonomia tends to think it. For them, capitalism is an inside, or the state is an inside, and that other things attempt to get outside of it, and that they say there is no outside in order to propose this sort of neo-Spinozist idea that everything is internally constituted, or that even struggle itself must come from some internal point, which, you know, I sort of take, I think, my politics, I think, kind of aligns with that, and I agree with many of the strategies that come from it. But I think the metaphysical schema that we get from D&G says that they begin with difference. They say that sort of the natural or the elementary or the original state, which, let's not put too much stock in this, but, that we begin with outsides. And this comes from the atomistic connective approach of Deleuze, in which he says, even the connection of two things is an additional third external connection. So it's about the relations between terms. And I suppose this could come through his neo-monadology, but also we could see it even as early as his Hume book. And so the creation of let's say a modern nation state is a very temporary, fragile inside that is quite precious and may not sustain. And just to refer to psychoanalysis quite briefly, I've always been interested in how D&G might problematize the topology or image of the psyche that we would get from, let's say, Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in which it's a fragile kernel that develops a shell in order to prevent the incursion of the outside, which might provide too much excitation or even disruption. And I think that we need to distinguish that from the body without organs, or say the body without organs needs to be better than, or beyond just this idea of a precious kernel that needs a shell in order to repel things. But perhaps what it is it's an image of the state, or how the state sees itself. It sees itself as constituting this precious interior stability that wards off too much on the outside. So I think the image that you present from Blade Runner or other sci-fi fantasies is precisely the image that we would be given from the state itself. And I think it has a few purposes. One, in order to give itself purpose and definition, but the other is in order to sort of authorize its own projects of social cleansing. Those on the outside are zombies or unworthy or outcasts. And they're not only there for a reason, but people need to be continually expelled to there if they're no good or found to be undesirable. And any attempting to come in that haven't been vetted as virtuous or good are deserving of death. And it's not that, and you so clearly show the biopolitical implications of it as well, that the state then tends to its own and everything outside of it sees as just something to disregard. And so it allows it to wither and die as bare life. On the question of the rebel, I really like this Michael Hart essay that was eventually incorporated into Empire. So that might actually be the easiest way to find it, but he published it separately in English in 1994, and it's called The Withering of Civil Society, and most of it still exists in Empire, in which he goes through a Hegelian notion of the state once again, and its three orders of the natural, the social, and the political. And he proposes the way in which Foucault problematizes that strata or spatial topography, then Deleuze, and then finally also Morio Tronti. And so I think there's a really clean analytic approach to it that I found quite helpful. And, of course, there's this older, it's not Hegel's rabbit, but it's this idea of rebel, but it's this idea of, in Marxism, we see as the confrontation of two great classes, which are the dominant antinomies of dialectical groups that must necessarily be in conflict, and that they will likely resolve through the constitution of a new society and a new set of conflicts. Whereas the search for other figures that you propose, like the rebel, but also the queer, the femme, and others, let's say even outside the family or other social structures that we look at, all of the minoritarian. That is precisely what D&G do. And so in 1,000 Plateaus, we get the idea of the non-denumerable multiplicity, the sort of grouping that no matter what analytic or demographic or statistical project we try to numerize all of them, there's still going to be a remainder to it. I think that there's a problem in which sometimes we could celebrate the undenumerable. It becomes very evasive. It becomes there's something alluring about the thing that cannot be counted. And I think that when we get such negative formulations, it becomes, it does more work than it kind of should. Though, of course, Lyotard on the remainder is also thinking about this. And so I really appreciated how you mentioned how they're not just sort of the uncountable who are of free movement and always radical or something. Like you say, they can be surplus population. They're migrants. They're all these other things. And it's a product of the dynamic of the axiomatic. So I might also draw people's attention to the apparatus of capture plateau, in which D&G say that the axiomatic tries to capitalize on 4 matter energy flows that it actually is able, or 4 flows that it productively tries to manage, but because there's an excess to the flow, it's always, it's going to fail in its complete management, but that, these are ambivalent. They're both how it justifies itself and the motor of its operations, but also these things that haunt it, and their excess can come to challenge, if not subvert or usurp it. And they mentioned 4 things. First is matter energy. I think this is quite vague, maybe not as helpful, but it's maybe a more thermodynamic principle or something. But then they say population. And so population is always going to be something that haunts states, capitalism, the world order from D&G's perspective. And I think the migrant crisis is one current version of it, but I think that there are many possible ways to continue thinking population as something that capitalism and empire needs, but then will also potentially be a site of vulnerability or its undoing. The third is food, which I find interesting and compelling. That food chains, food networks, things that we've been thinking and theorizing quite a bit now, but also has been a problem for a long time. Food will remain one of these things. And the last one is the urban. And I think that there's been a major shift from 1980, when they wrote this, to 2021. Globally, now more people live in cities, but the character of the cities has shifted. I think of Mike Davis's City of Slums, in which he thinks the majority of people moving to cities now are in these informal gray places that are only partially regulated, and often regulated through informal networks, some of them violent like gangs, but also other ones like deeply sort of free because they're outside the eyes of the state. And I think that it's these, all of these 4 flows could be more and interesting things to sort of develop as like the ambivalence of capitalism, the fact that it needs these flows in order to justify and operate and move forward, but that they could also challenge it and provide its undoing as well. So that's my start. Yeah, thanks.
Christo?
Yes, thank you, Andrew. Now we have a question from Yorgos. Και μετά υπάρχει μια ερώτηση. There is a question for you in the chat, and maybe we can, you can answer to it not by text, but publicly, so we can all hear your answer about the difference between pessimism and cynicism in Zizek, if you can see in the chat. So,
yes, great.
Okay.
The question says, a brief question, how do you describe the difference among pessimism and cynicism in Zizek, a way of explaining the problems of the world? So Zizek gets it from Peter Sloterdijk as well, who's a very strange figure. Peter Sloterdijk, by the way, used to be a TV host. He was involved in that new age hippie movement, Rajneesh, all this sort of stuff. But Sloterdijk's Critique of Cynical Reason, I think, is still an amazing book. I love Diogenes. Maybe you all love Diogenes. Maybe you hate Diogenes, and I suppose you have to do one or the other. I love Diogenes. Sloterdijk tries to argue for like a commonplace contemporary cynicism of just like irony and not taking things very seriously, versus an older form of cynicism that he tracks back to Greeks. To me, that's a less useful distinction. So I create my own distinction instead, of course. We're going to talk about pessimism versus cynicism. So cynicism, I still agree with Zizek and others. And they use it, or Zizek thinks of it within the context of ideology critique. So he says, you know, the old version of ideology critique we get as the like, he loves citing this sort of Christian maxim, you know, forgive them for they know not what they do. And so the idea there with ideology is people don't know what they're doing. They're being driven by unspoken, unknowing forces. And so they're sort of dupes or fools in the process. And that's the older model of ideology critique that we might be given. But what's funny is maybe psychoanalysis is an interesting intervention here to say that people may know their desires, but they may not know, or they may know their wants, but they'll never know their needs, and precisely the imbalance or mismatch between these will always cause problems. But, you know, through Sloterdijk, Zizek says, no, in fact, people say they know what they're doing and they still do it anyway. They say, oh, you know, I know this is bad for the earth, and then, you know, they don't recycle or something. I don't know, that's a very pedantic example, I'm sorry. But, you know, that people knowingly engage in things. They say, I am being racist, I love being racist, and here it is. So what's funny is, at least in the United States, it's considered rude and impolite. So, you know, there's a strange way in which people still navigate it. So maybe like liberals are still in the sort of, I don't know, I'm digressing. So cynicism is now the sort of way in which people are brashly doing things that are against their own self-interest or that they dislike, and they still do it anyway. And it's a weird sort of conundrum we find ourselves in. But, you know, it was popular in the popular press, things like hipster racism or the prevalence of irony. For me, I think that pessimism follows a different route in which it doesn't sort of fatalistically give up on things and say, you know, I know this is bad, but I'm going to do it anyway because I want to be self-indulgent or because I don't think it's really going to help in the long run. I think pessimism looks at, it doesn't try and make things more hopeful than they are. It is a very sane and sober analysis of the situation. And it doesn't look for simplistic or easy answers to create new areas of confidence. I think that one of the challenges with post-structuralism, and one reason that I think it's fallen out of fashion, is because I think that it was overly optimistic on the remainder, the uncountable, the supplement, these other little sort of tidbits of the forms of asymmetric warfare that it tried to wage against the state and capitalism and the globe. And that you would, one feeling that I had reading some literature is people would give this incredibly detailed, scary, demanding critique of the present, and then feel obligated in the conclusion to say, but we're not doomed because of, and then this very abstract or this very minor thing. And so I think pessimism is that demanding critique, that ruthless critique, without necessarily looking for the easy way out. Doesn't necessarily mean a meditative sitting with the critique, though that's something that the more sort of Heideggerian people are comfortable with. For me, I think that it's this Deleuzian problematics instead. How to make something that seems dire and intolerable and impossible into more of a problem. I don't mean the weird accelerationism of exaggerating racism or something, but I mean that there are problems that become so difficult that there's no material or practical way of addressing them. They seem too terrible. And so I think that those are the rare moments in which we're actually forced to use thought, in which our philosophical or theoretical resources actually start being valuable and useful. You know, because we know all the cliches and paradigms to just sort of repeat and give a canned response to so many things. But there are these moments in which things seem sort of impossibly dire. And I think that's the time in which we can sort of begin thinking. And it won't give us solutions, but it will actually genuinely provoke us to think in a way that we otherwise don't. That's my beginning. Thank you.
Τώρα η τελευταία ερώτηση από τον Γιώργο Βάρσο από το Department of French Literature in ECPA.
Thank you, Andrew, for for working on it with Deleuze in the way you do. Thank you, Chloe, for having translated. Andrew, thank you all for being here and for your wonderful talk. Now, the question could be indeed very, very brief. And if you think it will make sense, there's a very brief question, we could leave it at that. What I think is would be interesting is to think whether why should we continue thinking in terms of either or, meaning I prefer that to that. I intend to follow this line instead of the other one, or I believe this is what is correct to do, or a correct way of thinking instead of the other one. So why should one keep on thinking on such terms instead of thinking in terms of combination, I would say? That is, instead of thinking in terms of either or, think in terms of end-end, which would not necessarily mean a golden mean or something that would combine in a harmonious way. This could mean a very tense situation, a very tense equilibrium, where no one would really know what could come out of it. No one will really even know whether we are, for example, joyous or dark. Perhaps we could be both, perhaps none of these two, perhaps in between of those two. But the main thing would be that we wouldn't really be certain about whether we are on the right track or not. But we would be certain that we are working on it intensively. Well, that's about it.
Phenomenal question. You know, just to bring it back to a particular problematic, I think that this was the question of the circuit of struggles around the occupation of the squares, or all these public occupations from, you know, Spain, Tunisia, and Egypt, Turkey, all these places. And I dislike the whole fetish that democracy has become in the United States. So I tend to sort of very much distance myself from democracy theories and look for alternatives to it. And perhaps I'm being too precise in the lines that I draw, but I feel like these gatherings in that moment of time are precisely thinking through that combinatory logic that you're proposing. And I think that it moved past democracy. It was not about voting or representation. Wasn't about, you know, like there's this very American notion of like one person, one vote. It was none of these things. It was very much about an experiment of being together and combining unexpected elements. And I think that there's a very Guattarian notion of this. That's just like, what are the experiments of when you bring unexpected countercultural and political elements in a single place? I will say that I like it, so I don't want to criticize it. I think that the underspoken about, or the other element that's not discussed as much, is something that I found in a close reading of the Rhizome Plateau, in which D and G do not propose themselves as n+1, you know, just in the simple mathematical notation of this sort of addition or even combination that I think we so helpfully discussed through the movement of the squares. But instead, they propose an n-1. So we have to ask ourselves, n-1, what are they sort of discussing here? And so one way of getting at it is in just like very basic cybernetic models. A structure is defined by all of its structural elements, the n elements, the n number of elements that sort of add up to it. And so they were proposing an n-1 in the sense of what happens when we subtract one piece of what determines what makes the whole. And so I think maybe that's the complement to the combination. I think that we have both combination and some form of subtraction. And I don't think it's, you know, just -1, like that, you know, you have a crowd and then one person leaves and things necessarily or suddenly shift. But I think it's you take away in some ways one determinate element, something very substantial from the circumstance that we thought was necessary, that required stability, and then what happens? And so maybe that would be my counterpose to you as well. Yes, the combination, but also the subtraction.
Thank you, Varsos, and thank you, Andrew. Νομίζω ότι φτάσαμε στο τέλος. We want to thank Andrew one more time. We're looking forward to the next presentation that you will give us, probably through the new book. Ευχαριστούμε όλους που πήραν μέρος, τους 4 εισηγητές και όλους τους που έβαλαν τις
ερωτήσεις. Εμείς σας ευχαριστούμε όλους. Thank you also. Thank you.
Αν δεν σας δούμε τώρα πια, if we will not meet in Pilion in ομιλίες, we'll meet in next year's seminar on Deleuze-Guattari. And I say, I thank you, and I say good night, Andrew, and thank you very much.
Good morning to Andrew, I think.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you,
Good morning.
for all your work. Yeah.
For this beautiful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you once again. Have a nice day.
You're very popular in Greek, Andrew.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I'm overwhelmed by it, and people should send me emails if they're interested to keep the conversation going. I'm bad at responding quickly, but I almost always end up responding.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everything. So good night and good morning to everyone, wherever you are.
Good morning and good night.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Again. Bye.
Yes, sir.
Have a nice day, everyone.
Yes, sir.
Καληνύχτα, παιδιά.
Ευχαριστούμε όλους.
Ευχαριστούμε.